Testing 1 2 1 2. All right, sounds like we're good. All right. Shalom, shalom. First and foremost, I want to say call halal yamala Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai Ba'ashem Harakak Wadash. Double honors to the apostles, the bishops, and the elders of Great Millstone that I learned this truth from, and also peace and salutation to the hopeful elect of the nation of Israel, scattered throughout the four corners of the earth. And the title of this video is going to be to understand the Gentiles in the New Testament. You must understand the prophecies of the Gentiles in the Old Testament. All right. Because, as you have to this very day, Christians still going back and forth against Israelites, still going back and forth against the men of the Lord. Okay. When you're out there on the highways and the byways preaching the word, okay, you still to this day have Christians that'll come up, all right, arguing different topics, arguing different things in the scriptures. And of course, as always, one of the major topics that always come up with these Christians is the whole controversy of the Gentiles. Okay, the whole controversy of the Gentiles in regards to salvation and mercy and redemption and victory and all these things. Okay, and of course, the Christian always comes from the perspective of the Gentiles that are promised salvation and mercy and all these things is talking about all humanity, all nations, okay, that call on, so-called Jesus Christ. Whereas we Israelites, okay, starting with the men of the Lord, starting with the apostles, the bishops, and the elders of Great Millstone, down to the least of us that are of the hopeful elect, okay, we go into the scriptures and show that the Gentiles that Paul and Barnabas were sent to teach that are promised salvation and mercy are actually Israelites, okay, scattered Israelites, okay, and to this day with these Christians is just still ongoing back and forth, okay, and ultimately these Christians just they don't have the Holy Spirit and they don't have the understanding of the scriptures, all right, and as well these Christians as they always because these Christians think in their minds that the whole concept of Gentiles being accepted by the Most High Yahweh through His begotten Son Yahweh Shai. They think in their minds that this whole concept of the Gentiles being accepted and being saved is a concept that started, okay, in the book of Matthew, in the New Testament, or in the book of Acts. Okay, but no, we the hopeful elect of the nation of Israel, we understand that the concept of the Gentiles of receiving salvation and receiving mercy from Yahweh Shema Shai is ultimately a concept that goes back to prophecies in the Old Testament. All right, because real quick, as Scripture says in the book of Romans 15 in verse 4, it says, "For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope." Okay, and at the time of John the Baptist, Yahushua, the disciples, apostles, okay, what were the writings that they had available to them, during their time 2,000 years ago? Okay, the writing of course, the law, the Torah, the first five books, okay, the writing of the prophets, all right, the Psalms, the Proverbs, okay, the historical books of the scriptures, Kings, Samuel, Chronicles, Esther, so on and so forth, Nehemiah, okay, and so a lot of the things that uh a lot of the understandings, all right, and the things that they knew, okay, talking about the disciples turned apostles, okay, a lot of the things that was opened up to them by Yahushua, okay, in regards to salvation, the kingdom, all right, and all these things, including the Gentiles, were things that were, that goes back to was prophesied in the Old Testament, the writings of the prophets, okay, certain things written in the law. Okay. And as the Apostle Paul said here in Romans 15 and 4 again, for whatsoever things were written aforetime, okay, aforetime means before time, before their time, right? The law, the prophets, the Psalms, so on and so forth were written for our learning, okay? The writings of the Old Testament, okay, were written for our learning to understand the things that we read in the New Testament, all right, the Gospels, the epistles of Paul, the epistles of the apostles, okay, the book of Acts, right? And and I want to go here to Colossians, all right, the book of Colossians, chapter 1 and verse 25. It says, whereof I am made a minister according to the dispensation of Yahweh, which is given to me for you to fulfill the word of Yahweh Bashem Shai. All right, verse 26. Even the mystery which had been hid from ages and from generations, but now is made manifest to his saints. Verse 27. To whom Yahweh Bashem Shai, okay, would make known what is the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is Hamashiach in you, the hope of glory. Okay, so the Apostle Paul here in Colossians, the first chapter, he likens the understanding of the Gentiles in the New Testament. Okay, they were promised, salvation and mercy that the Apostle Paul was sent to go out and teach. All right. The Apostle Paul, as we see right here, likens the understanding of the Gentiles in the New Testament to a mystery. Okay. The mystery of the Gentiles. All right. And when we go to this word mystery, all right, this word mystery is, I'm going to let this play.
Strong's G 3466, Mustadion. Mustadion.
All right. And it means what? Hidden thing, secret, mystery. It says generally mysteries, religious secrets, confided only to the initiated and not to ordinary mortals. Okay. Because, when you deal with the scriptures, all right, prophecies, dark sayings, parables, okay, certain stories of the scriptures, and even in this case, the understanding of the Gentiles. Okay, that's not a mystery that's open to ordinary mortals. Okay, just any and everybody that has their hand on the Bible. Okay, that calls themselves believing in the God of the Bible, believing in His begotten Son. Okay, the understanding of the scriptures, and in this case, the Gentiles, is not open up to just ordinary mortals. Okay, that understanding is only open up to the initiated, which is the elect. Okay, us, the hopeful elect, the remnant of the nation of Israel. Lord will not be of that number. Okay, and it continues to say, a hidden or secret thing, not obvious to the understanding. Okay, not obvious to the understanding. And you see, if the understanding of the Gentiles in the New Testament was that, it's talking about, actual heathen nations, okay, the actual non-Israelite nations, all right, then that will make the understanding of the Gentiles not a mystery, because that will be obvious, because in the scriptures, throughout the scriptures, generally in most cases, the word Gentile is used to refer to, the actual other nations, the non-Israelite nations. So if that was the case with the Gentiles that Paul was in Barnabas was sent out to teach, that, he was sent to teach actual heathen nations, actual non-Israelite nations, then that will make the understanding of the Gentiles in the New Testament obvious and not a mystery. Okay. But it's a mystery, okay, because when you go deep into the understanding of the scriptures and when you deal with the volume of the book, you find out, okay, that the Gentiles that Paul and Barnabas were ultimately sent to go out and teach throughout the surrounding regions were actually Israelites. Okay, That's where the mystery comes in. All right. And as it goes into definition 3, it says a hidden purpose or counsel, secret will of men. And then it says right here of the Most High God, Yahweh, the secret counsels which govern the Most High in dealing with the righteous, which are hidden from ungodly and wicked men, but plain to the godly. You see that? Hidden from ungodly and wicked men. Okay, those who don't have the Holy Spirit that the Lord is not dealing with. Okay, including these Christians. All right, but plain to the godly, which is who? The elect. That's the hopeful elect, the remnant of the nation of Israel. All right, and also as the scriptures says in the book of Sirach, in the Apocrypha, Salakia, Sirach 39. Was that Sirach 39? And yep, Sirach 39 and 24 says, as his ways are plain unto the holy, all right, the initiated, okay, so are they stumbling blocks unto the wicked. You see that? So the ways of Yahweh Shema Shai and his scriptures, his prophecies, the understanding of the volume of the book, the Bible, okay, and in this case, the understanding of the Gentiles in the New Testament are plain and simple to the holy, the elect, all right, us, the remnant of the nation of Israel. Lord will not be able to number, but at the same time, okay, this understanding is also stumbling blocks unto the wicked. Okay, the understanding of the Gentiles, the Greeks in the New Testament, the uncircumcision, the heathen that the Lord is going to justify through the blood of Yahweh Shai. All right, all these things are stumbling blocks, okay, to these people in the world that the Lord is not dealing with. All right, these Christians, okay, the 2/3 of our people that's still caught up in the Christian church, okay, believing that that all nations can be saved and this, that, and the third, right? Because again, as we read in Colossians, the first chapter, the Apostle Paul likens the understanding of the Gentiles in the New Testament to a mystery. Okay, and if the Gentiles that Paul was sent to go out and teach was actual heathen nations, actual non-Israelite nations, then that wouldn't make it a mystery. That would make it obvious. Okay, but where the mystery comes in at, all right, because mind you, when you try to solve a mystery, right? Let's say maybe a crime mystery or a murder mystery or a mystery of something or someone going missing, right? In order to properly solve that mystery, you have to go back to where the problem began in the first place. You see that? You have to go back to where the problem began in the beginning. You see, and that's the case with, all right, the Gentiles in the scriptures that the Lord is going to have mercy upon and give salvation to. You have to go back, okay, in the beginning where the problem, all right, started off in the first place, which, okay, the issue of, the Israelites being likened to Gentiles goes back to the curses, okay? Let's get Deuteronomy 28, all right, which we always bring this out, okay, from the apostles and the bishops and the elders of Great Millstone that I learned the truth from, all the way down to the least of us of the hopeful elect. Okay, Deuteronomy 28 in verse 64. This is going into the curse that the Lord brought upon Israel. All right, for breaking the law and breaking that first covenant. Okay, Deuteronomy 28 verse 64. And the Lord Yahweh shall scatter thee among all people. All right, scatter thee among all people from one end of the earth even unto the other. All right, throughout the four corners of the earth. And it says, and there shalt thou and there thou shalt serve other gods which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. Okay, so one of the major curses that the Lord brought upon, all right, Israel, all right, the Israelites, his chosen people, was that he would scatter us throughout, all nations throughout the earth, okay, among all people, as just read, and that what? Throughout history, as our people will be scattered amongst these heathen nations, we would bow to their gods, okay, serve their idols, okay, getting adopt their customs, their culture, their languages, right? Make even make marriages with them, okay, and through all right, for so many centuries and so many generations of our people being scattered amongst the heathen, okay, and learning their works and bowing to their gods and taking on their customs, okay. When we go to First Corinthians, the 12th chapter, okay, at the time of Yahushua and the disciples, all right, this is what the Apostle Paul says right here in First Corinthians 12 and 2, okay, to the Israelites, all right, that were dwelling in Corinth, Greece. First Corinthians 12, verse 2. Ye know that ye were Gentiles, all right? Ye know that ye were Gentiles carried away unto these dumb idols, even as ye were led. See that? So Israel, all right, as for generations throughout history, as we were scattered more and more throughout the earth, okay, amongst the heathen nations, all right, amongst the non-Israelite nations, okay, and bow to their idols and worship their gods and take on their customs and their cultures. All right, doing all these things eventually made our people liken unto Gentiles. You see that? Not literal Gentiles, but Gentiles because what? Because we took on the customs and the cultures of the heathen nations, the actual literal Gentiles. You see that? So the Apostle Paul said, all right, talking to Israelites right here, that that ye know that ye were Gentiles. Why? Carried away unto these dumb idols. Okay, carried away by the idols and the gods and the deities of these heathen nations. Okay, that made our people like unto Gentiles, as we were scattered throughout the earth amongst the actual heathen nations. Okay, and so so with that, all right, let's go into some actual prophecies in the Old Testament. Okay, that speaks of the Lord having some form of mercy or salvation or redemption, okay, to the Gentiles. All right. So let's start off with Isaiah 11. All right, Isaiah 11, and let's start at verse 10. It says, "And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people." All right, and of course this root of Jesse is talking about Yahweh. Okay, because who's Jesse when you go into the scriptures? Jesse was the father of King David. Okay, Jesse was the father of King David. And when you go into the volume of the book, all right, it was always prophesied that the Messiah, Yahweh would come from the loins and lineage of David. Okay, the root and the offspring of David. All right, when you go into the scriptures. Okay, so Isaiah 11, verse 10 again. "And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people." All right, talking about Yahweh. To it, to it shall the Gentiles seek. Okay, and his rest shall be glorious. All right, so here we see a prophecy of the Gentiles, okay, ultimately seeking Yahweh, basically. All right, to it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. Now, as we continue reading down, verse 11, it says, "And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, all right, which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea." Okay, verse 12, "And he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcast of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth." All right. So as it went into, all right, Isaiah 11, starting from verse 10, okay, it spoke of and prophesied about the Gentiles, okay, seeking the ensign, the root of Jesse, which is ultimately speaking of Yahushua. So it's going into the Gentiles ultimately seeking Yahushua Hamashiach, right? But as we continue reading down, all right, it eventually, started speaking of what? Okay, verse 12. "And he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth." So why, all right, If it spoke of the Gentiles in verse 10, then why, as we continue reading down, then all of a sudden it jumped to the Lord assembling and gathering the outcasts of Israel and gathering the dispersed of Judah throughout the four corners of the earth. Okay, because that's the Gentiles that is speaking of right here in this prophecy. Okay, the Israelites that will be scattered throughout the four corners of the earth. All right, amongst the Gentile nations. Okay, that's what it's talking about right here in Isaiah the 11th chapter concerning the prophecy of the Gentiles in this chapter. The Lord ultimately restoring, okay, as it says right here, the remnant restored. Okay, what remnant? The remnant of the nation of Israel. All right, because real quick, when you go to the previous chapter, right, Isaiah 10, Isaiah 10, all right, verse 20, a remnant will return. All right. Isaiah 10, verse 20. And it shall come to pass in that day that the remnant of Israel and such as are escaped of the house of Jacob shall no more again stay upon him that smote them. All right. And who's the him that has smitten us Israelites in his outer days? Esau, Edom, the so called white man. All right. The man of sin, according to the scriptures. All right. It says, shall no more again stay upon him that smote them, but shall stay upon the Lord Yahweh Shema Shai, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. You see that? And how are we the hopeful elect of the remnant of the nation of Israel, staying upon the Lord Yahweh in truth by leaning upon faith in his begotten Son, Yahweh Shai. Okay? And it says, verse 21, the remnant shall return, even the remnant of Jacob, unto the mighty power Yahweh. Okay, verse 22. For though thy people Israel be as the sand of the sea, okay, an innumerable multitude scattered throughout the earth, right? Yet a remnant of them shall return. The consumption decreed shall overflow with righteousness. See that? So as we see, when the Bible speaks of the remnant that would return back to the heavenly Father through his begotten Son Yahweh Shai. All right, it's talking about the remnant of Israel, the remnant of Jacob. Okay, the remnant, the elect amongst all the 12 tribes of Israel. Lord willing, I be of that number. Okay, and so when we go back to Isaiah 11, all right, to Isaiah 11 and verse 11 again, the remnant restored. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord Yahweh shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, okay, which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea, right, which represents, different regions where the Lord's people will be scattered at, even to this present day, right? And it says in verse 12, and he shall set up an ensign for the nations, Yahweh Shai, and shall assemble the outcast of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. You see that? So that's the Gentiles that is speaking of here in verse 10 in Isaiah the 11th chapter. Okay, it's talking about Israel, the Israelites, the remnant of Israel that will be scattered amongst the actual Gentile nations. Okay, that would wake up to the truth in these latter days. Okay, through the preaching of Yahweh Shai by the men of the Lord, right? Starting with the apostles, the bishops, and the elders of Great Millstone, as well as the men that labor before them, going back to our forefather Albert Bivens, all right, in the the late 60s, early 70s. Okay, it's talking about Israelites, all right, Israelites likened to Gentiles being restored back to Yahweh Shema Shai from the four corners of the earth. All right, starting with okay, the elect, the remnant waking up to this truth, all right, being gathered by the word before being gathered by the return of Yahweh Shai. You see that? That's one scripture here in the Old Testament, okay, that's prophesies of the Gentiles coming to the Lord, and as we went into, is ultimately speaking of okay, the outcasts of Israel, okay, the Israelites scattered throughout the four corners of the earth among the Gentiles, the heathen nations. All right. So let's get another prophecy. All right, let's go to Isaiah 49. All right, Isaiah 49 in verse 6. It says, "And he said, it is a light thing that thou shouldest be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the end of the earth." Okay, so this is another scripture that Christians have used over the years. All right, here in Isaiah in the Old Testament, okay, to try to push the doctrine that all nations can be saved, and people from different nations throughout the earth can receive salvation to the Lord. All right, as long as they call on sweet Jesus and all these things. This is one of the scriptures that Christians have used over the years in the Old Testament, in the book of Isaiah, okay, to further reinforce their universalism slash replacement theology doctrine, okay, of all nations, receiving salvation. You see that? But, all right, in order to properly understand Isaiah 49, verse 6, okay, you got to start right here in verse 5, to get the whole context of, who these Gentiles are speaking of here in verse 6, okay? Because, like the scripture says in Isaiah 28, line upon line, all right? So, Isaiah 49, and let's start at verse 5, it says, "And now said the Lord Yahweh, that formed me from the womb to be a servant, to bring Jacob again to him." Okay. Though Israel be not gathered, okay, though Israel be not gathered, because what? Israel is scattered throughout the four corners of the earth, right? "Yet shall I be glorious in the eyes of the Lord Yahweh, and my power shall be my strength." Right? Verse 6. "And he said, it is a light thing that thou shouldest be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the ends of the earth." All right. Verse 7. "Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, the Redeemer of Israel, the Redeemer of Israel, and his Holy One, to him whom man despiseth, to him whom the nation abhorreth, to a servant of rulers. Kings shall see and arise, princes also shall worship, because of the Lord Yahweh that is faithful, and the Holy One of Israel, and he shall choose thee." Okay, so as we see, matter of fact, verse 8, "Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, in an acceptable time have I heard thee, and in a day of salvation have I helped thee, and I will preserve thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people, to establish the earth, to cause to inherit the desolate heritages." All right. So as we've been reading down from verse 5 down to verse 8 in Isaiah 49, okay, in verse 6 right here, we see, all right, as I said, I will give, I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, right? But as we read throughout this whole, passage, this whole prophecy is all centered around the Lord, all right, restoring and redeeming Israel, okay, raising up the tribes of Jacob, as it says in verse 5 again, Isaiah 49, verse 5. "And now said the Lord Yahweh, that formed me from the womb to be a servant, to bring Jacob again to him, though Israel be not gathered." Right? And why is that? Because Israel, pursuant to the curses in Deuteronomy 28 and 64 that I read earlier, Israel would be scattered throughout the earth, okay, scattered among the heathen, scattered amongst the actual Gentile nations, right? Worshiping their gods, bowing to their idols, okay, as we read in 1 Corinthians 12 and 2 earlier. "Ye know that ye were Gentiles, carried away by dumb idols." See that? So, as we see here in Isaiah 49, okay, which is another prophecy that prophesies about the Gentiles coming back to the Lord, right? As we see, is all centered around Israel, okay, the tribes of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel, are starting with the elect, the remnant, of course, coming back to the Lord. You see that? Being redeemed back to the Lord Yahweh, through Yahweh Shah Mashiach. See that? So this is all right. This is a prophecy, okay, talking about scattered Israelites, liking that the Gentiles coming back to the Lord. You see that? And as it said in verse 8, Isaiah 49, verse 8, thus saith the Lord Yahweh, in an acceptable time have I heard thee, and in a day of salvation have I helped thee. Okay, so it's speaking about salvation, which is a future prophecy. You see that? When Yahweh Shah returns, it says, and I will preserve thee and give thee for a covenant of the people to establish the earth, to cause to inherit the desolate heritages. See that? Now it says, and give thee for a covenant of the people, right? Now, of course, what covenant could that be talking about? All right. It's talking about ultimately the new covenant, which, all right, when we go into the new covenant, okay, as we always, the men of the Lord go into from time to time, all right, when we go into the new covenant, all right, let's get Hebrews 8. Hebrews 8 and verse 7, a new covenant. All right, it says, for if that first covenant had been faultless, right, who was under that first covenant? Israel, via the giving of the law. Okay, the laws, the commandments, the statutes, the ordinance of animal sacrifice. Okay, the Levitical priesthood being our mediators under that first covenant, with Aaron and his descendants being the high priest under that first covenant. Okay, which we as Israelites, all Israel, we all sinned and broke that first covenant, right? From the Levitical priest, from the high priesthood of Aaron to the different kings over Judah and different kings over Israel, all the way down to the lowest Israelite. As it speaks of in Daniel and the ninth chapter. Of all Israel have sinned, roughly paraphrasing it. You see that? And so, as it says again here in Hebrews 8 and verse 7, for if that first covenant had been faultless, okay, had been faultless, and ultimately, who was the one who was at fault under that first covenant? It was, us Israelites, right? We went off. The first covenant didn't go off, but we went off. You see that? It said, for if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. Verse 8, for finding fault with them, he said, behold, the days come, said the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Okay, Judah and Israel in prophecy represents the northern and southern kingdom of the nation of Israel. All right, because when you go into First Kings the 11th chapter, all right, you read about when Solomon sinned and he bowed to the idols of those heathen women that he married, right? One of the major punishments that the Lord brought upon Solomon was that the nation of Israel will be split into two kingdoms due to the sins of Solomon. All right, you had the northern kingdom led by the tribe of Ephraim, right, and then of course you had the southern kingdom known as the kingdom of Judah, led by the tribe of Judah. All right, and along with the southern kingdom with Judah, you also had Benjamin and Levi. Okay, linked with Judah. All right, that's who made up the southern kingdom. Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. All right. And of course, the northern kingdom being led by the tribe of Ephraim, known as the kingdom of Israel. Right. And so, as it says again, Hebrews 8, verse 8, for finding fault with them, he said, behold, the days come, said the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. All right. All 12 tribes, starting with the tabernacle of David. All right. The elect amongst all 12 tribes, the remnant. Right. Verse 9, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continue not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, said the Lord. Verse 10, for this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, said the Lord Yahweh. I will put my laws in their mind and write them in their hearts. Okay, because the new covenant is not going to be based upon the law being written on stone tablets or being written on paper. No, now it's going to be based on Yahweh Shema Shai writing his laws and his commandments within our inward parts, programming us, okay, to live and be perfect according to his laws. All right. And of course, it's all going to be done through Yahweh Shema Shai giving us those new bodies. You see that? It says again, Hebrews 8, verse 10. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, said the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. You see that? And of course, as we read up above, who is this new covenant going to be made with? Judah and Israel, all 12 tribes. Okay, the nation of Israel, starting with the remnant, the elect. You see that? The Lord is going to program his laws and his commandments in our minds, in our hearts, okay, via giving us the new bodies. All right. And it says, verse 11, and they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for all shall know me from the least to the greatest. Okay. All Israel in the kingdom under this new covenant is going to know Yahweh Shema Shai in perfection. Okay. Because in the kingdom, we're not going to have to teach another Israelite, okay, the laws and the commandments, how to get right with the Lord, okay, how to obey Yahweh Shema Shai. We're not going to have to teach other Israelites that no more in the kingdom because, the Lord's, his wisdom and his laws and his instruction is going to be programmed into us automatically, okay, via the new bodies. You see that? But the heathen nations, all right, when you go to, Isaiah, the second chapter, all right, the heathen in the kingdom. All right, when you read Isaiah, the second chapter, okay, when the Lord's going to establish his mountain, which is ultimately the tabernacle of David, okay, the governing body that's going to rule under Yahweh Shai in the kingdom. All right, Isaiah 2, verse 3, and many people shall go and say, come ye and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the power of Jacob, right, the house of David. And he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord Yahweh Shema Shai from Jerusalem. You see that? And that's what these heathen are going to be doing in the kingdom of heaven. See that? So showing you that the heathen will not be under the new covenant. Okay? They're going to have to be taught the laws and the commandments and the statutes and the wisdom and the instruction of Yahweh Shema Shai in the kingdom. Okay, showing you that no heathen will be under the new covenant. Okay, they're not going to receive the new bodies. They're not going to be under the new covenant. They're not going to be ruling with us in the kingdom of heaven with the tabernacle of David in power once again under Yahweh Shai. Okay, no, the heathen are ultimately going to be subject under us in the kingdom. Okay, with via a rod of iron, okay, going over their heads according to the laws and the commandments. You see that? So the new covenant, as we read here in Hebrews 8, is going to entail that the Lord is going to write his laws and his commandments within the hearts and the minds of Judah and Israel, all 12 tribes, starting with the elect, the tabernacle of David. You see that? And so when we go back to Isaiah 49 and verse 8 again, it says, thus saith the Lord Yahweh Shema Shai, in an acceptable time have I heard thee, and in a day of salvation have I helped thee, and I will preserve thee and give thee for a covenant of the people to establish the earth. All right. And we just read what people the Lord is going to make his new covenant with. All right. Israel, all 12 tribes. Okay. And mind you as well. All right. How could any heathen nation come under the new covenant? Right. Because for the Lord to make a new covenant with a particular people, right, that would imply that the Lord previously made an old covenant with that particular people, right? So when you're reading in the scriptures in the law, if the Lord never made any form of old covenant or previous covenant with any of the heathen nations, then how would any heathen have to come under a new covenant, right, if they were never brought into any form of old covenant, right? Only the Israelites were brought under that first covenant, okay, the previous covenant. And therefore what? Because we as Israelites broke that first covenant, we broke the laws, we took on the ways of the heathen nations, made particular covenants and deals with them and bowed to their gods and took on their customs. Only Israel would need to be brought into a new covenant with their Lord, Yahweh Shema Shai, because we broke the old covenant or the previous covenant. You see that? And so again, Isaiah 49 verse 8 again, thus saith the Lord Yahweh Bashim Shai, in an acceptable time have I heard thee, and in a day of salvation have I helped thee, and I will preserve thee and give thee for a covenant of the people to establish the earth, to cause to inherit the desolate places. All right. And I always like to read this verse in the NLT, okay, because ultimately in the kingdom of heaven, when we Israelites, starting with the elect, the tabernacle of David, okay, under Yahweh Shai, when we get into the kingdom and we establish the kingdom of heaven, all right, as it said, we're going to establish the earth. All right, we're going to clean up the earth, clean up the air, clean up the water, restore the animals back to their natural habitats again, right? So that the animal can do their job within the ecosystem again, right? You know, and ultimately under Yahweh Shah, we're going to turn the earth back to Eden again, paradise, as the Lord intended it to be in the beginning. You see that? And as I always like to read Isaiah 49, verse 8 in the NLT, it says, this is what the Lord Yahweh says, at just the right time, I will respond to you. On the day of salvation, I will help you, right? Ultimately leading to when Yahweh Shah comes back, right? It says, I will protect you and give you to the people as my covenant with them. All right. We just read the new covenant is only for the Israelites. Okay. All 12 tribes. Right. And it says, through you, I will reestablish the land of Israel and assign it to his own people again. Okay. Through you, I will reestablish the land of Israel and assign it to his own people again. Now, when you go through, literally all throughout the volume of the book, okay, who was the land of Israel ultimately promised to in the scriptures? Okay, even going all the way back to the promise that the Lord made with our forefather Abraham. Okay, who did the Lord promise to promise that the land of Israel would ultimately be passed down to? Okay, it will be ultimately given to Abraham through who? Through Isaac, through Jacob, right? And it will fall upon the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, which let's get the book of Psalms. That's Psalms 106, I want to say. Okay, Psalms 105. Yep, Psalms 105 and verse 6. Okay, Psalms 105, verse 6, it says, O ye seed of Abraham, his servant, ye children of Jacob, his chosen. All right. Why is Jacob, okay, linked with the seed of Abraham? Okay, because that's ultimately, as we're going to read down, is who the promise trickled down to. Okay. It says, verse 7, He is the Lord Yahweh Bashim Shai, our power, all right, our God. His judgments are in all the earth. Verse 8, He hath remembered his covenant forever, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations, which covenant he made with Abraham and his oath unto Isaac, okay, which Isaac was the chosen seed that came out of Abraham, right, through his wife Sarah, okay, because we know in Genesis 17 that it's like in Genesis around about the 16th chapter to be exact, that Ishmael was the technical firstborn son of Abraham, right? Through Hagar, his concubine, the handmaid of Sarah, right? Ishmael was the technical firstborn son of Abraham, right? But then when you read in Genesis 17, ultimately the promise, the Lord said that he wouldn't promise, that he wouldn't pass down a promise to Ishmael, but instead he will pass down a promise that he made with Abraham to Abraham's son Isaac that he had with Sarah. Okay, Psalms 105 verse 9, which covenant he made with Abraham and his oath unto Isaac. Okay, verse 10, and confirm the same unto Jacob. Okay, who's Jacob? The chosen son of Isaac. All right, Genesis 25, Isaac and Rebekah had who? Esau and Jacob. All right, and out of those two sons, as of course, throughout the volume of the book, the promise that was made to Abraham that was passed down to Isaac, okay, was then passed down to Jacob. You see that? The chosen son of Isaac and Rebekah. It says, and confirmed the same unto Jacob for a law, and to Israel for an everlasting covenant. See that? The 12 tribes of Israel for an everlasting covenant. Okay, the covenant that the Lord made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, which cannot be disannulled, which is immutable, as it speaks of in Hebrews 6th chapter. Okay, the covenant that the Lord made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which fell trickled down to the 12 tribes of Israel, cannot be uh, 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 cannot be altered. Is immutable. It cannot be replaced, as these Christians love to push that replacement theology doctrine, right? Well, now anybody that calls on Jesus Christ, regardless of their race or nation of people that they descend from, they cannot be included with the promise made to Abraham, you know. But as we're reading right here, and as you go throughout the volume of the book, the promise that was made to Abraham didn't start and stop with just Abraham. It was passed down to Isaac, down to Jacob, all right, down to the 12 tribes of Israel for an everlasting covenant, an everlasting promise. You see that? Saying what? Verse 11, Psalms 105, verse 11, saying, unto thee will I give the land of Canaan, the lot of your inheritance. All right. And that was who inhabited the Holy Land eventually before our forefathers got into that land after coming out of ancient Egypt. All right. It was those Canaanites though that was dwelling in the Holy Land, right? Doing all kinds of odious works and witchcrafts, as you read in Wisdom of Solomon, the 12th chapter, right? Doing all kinds of wickedness. And then the Lord, during the time of Joshua, eventually, sent our forefathers into that land, the promised land, the land of Israel, to root out those Canaanites and those different, the Hittites and the Amorites and all those different Hamitic nations. Okay, you know, the Lord, had our forefathers get them up out of there. You see that? Because ultimately, what? That land was ultimately promised, okay, to the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel. All right. And so, reading Isaiah 49 and verse 8 again in the NLT, all right, this is what the Lord, Yahweh Shai, says. At just the right time, I will respond to you. On the day of salvation, I will help you. I will protect you and give you to the people as my covenant with them. Though through you I will reestablish the land of Israel and assign it to its own people again, which is who? The Israelites, the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. No heathen nation has part in the promise, all right, of the land of Israel or the region of the promised land for that matter. From the Euphrates River all the way to the Nile River in Egypt. Okay, because that's ultimately the promised land that the Lord promised to Abraham and to his seed. Okay, no heathen nation will take part in this promise. Okay, or the new covenant. All right, or ruling under Yahushua in the kingdom of heaven. All right, that's only for Israelites. You see that? But as this lesson is going to, okay, the Gentiles that we read about here in Old Testament prophecy that's promised salvation and mercy and redemption to the Lord. That's talking about Israel, Israelites, okay, scattered Israelites throughout the four corners of the earth. All right. And so let's get another one. All right. Let's get also in the book of Isaiah. Salakia. Not Isaiah 49. Also in the book of Isaiah 42. All right, Isaiah 42, and let's start from the top. It says, behold my servant whom I uphold, mine elect in whom my soul delighteth. Okay, and this servant, this elect that is speaking of here in Isaiah 42 is talking about Yahweh Shai. Okay, this is speaking of Yahweh Shai. Okay, because of course we know that the scriptures talks about the elect of the nation of Israel, the remnant, right? Salakia, those first fruit spirits, okay, before the foundation of the heaven and the earth. All right. But ultimately, where does the Most High's elect, Okay, his first fruits spirits ultimately begin with. Okay, began with Yahweh Shai. Yahweh Shai was the first elect and a first fruit spirit created by the Most High Yahweh. You see that? Before the foundation of the heaven and earth. And so this elect, this servant that we're reading of right here in Isaiah 42 is speaking of Yahweh Shai. It says, "Behold my servant whom I uphold, mine elect, in whom my soul delighteth. I have put my spirit upon him. He shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles." Okay, so here we see again in prophecy. Okay, speaking of the Gentiles, right? Verse 2. And mind you as well, what we're reading of here in Isaiah 42 on down, Yahweh Shah himself even quoted, okay, what we're reading of here in Isaiah 42 in the Gospels, okay, in the book of Matthew the 12th chapter, all right, which you can read upon it, you can read upon it on your own. I'm not going to go into it, but even Yahweh Shah himself confirmed that this prophecy right here in Isaiah 42 is speaking of him, okay. And again, you can read about it in the book of Matthew, the 12th chapter. But verse 2, Isaiah 42, verse 2, he shall not cry nor lift up, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. A bruised reed shall he not break, and the smoking flax shall he not quench. He shall bring forth judgment unto truth. All right. Verse 4, he shall not fail nor be discouraged till he hath set judgment in the earth, and the isles shall wait for his law. Verse 5, thus saith the Most High Yahweh the Lord, he that created the heavens and stretched them out, he that spread forth the earth and that which cometh out of it, he that giveth breath unto the people upon it, and spirit to them that walk therein. Verse 6, I, the Lord Yahweh Bashem Shai, have called thee in righteousness, and will hold thine hand, and will keep thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people, for a light of the Gentiles. All right. So as we see here again, another prophecy in the Old Testament, okay, prophesying of, some type of mercy or favor or salvation or redemption to the Gentiles. Okay. But as it said again in verse 6, I, the Lord Yahweh, have called thee in righteousness, and will hold thine hand, and will keep thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people, for a light of the Gentiles. All right. And as we read in Hebrews 8 chapter earlier, okay, who's the new covenant for, according to prophecy? We read earlier that it's only for Israel and Judah, okay, all 12 tribes, starting with the elect. You see that? So as this prophecy here in Isaiah 42 is speaking of the Gentiles, right? For a light of the Gentiles, okay, being brought into a covenant, a new covenant with the Lord. This is only talking about Israel, Israelites, because only Israelites will be brought under the new covenant. All right, because again, all right, if for these Christians and these people in the world, okay, pushing that whole replacement theology doctrine, teaching that actual heathen, actual non-Israelite nations could be entered into the new covenant. Well, you have to ask yourself, well, when were the actual heathen, the actual non-Israelite nations brought under an old covenant or a previous covenant to the Lord to have to be eventually entered into a new covenant? Okay, you're not going to find that in the scriptures, because the only people that the Lord made a covenant with in the scriptures, all right, was the nation of Israel. Okay, giving us the laws, the commandments, the statutes, all right, with Moses being our mediator under that first covenant, all right, the Levitical priesthood being established as the priests of the nation of Israel under that first covenant, with the high priesthood going through Aaron and his descendants, all right. Only the Israelites were brought into a previous covenant or an old covenant to the Lord Yahweh, okay. But of course, through Israel breaking that first covenant and being in fault. Therefore, what? The Lord Yahweh Shema Shai promised in prophecy that he would eventually make a new covenant with his people Israel. You see that? And only Israel, Israel and Judah, all 12 tribes. You see that? So as we're reading of this prophecy of the Gentiles here in Isaiah 42, okay, being given a covenant, right, to the Lord, that shows once again is only talking about Israel, right? When you understand the volume of the book, when you understand the prophecy, right? Because again, these Christians, many of them are of the opinion that the concept of the Lord establishing some type of mercy or favor or salvation to the Gentiles. They're of the opinion that that's a concept that only started in the New Testament when you open up the book of Matthew and read on forward. No, as we're seeing right here, okay, the concept of the Gentiles being given mercy and favor from the Lord and salvation and coming back to the Lord. Okay, as we see, that's only all right. That all only applies to Israelites, scattered Israelites, raised up as Gentiles. Okay, raised up worshiping the idols and the different gods of the Gentiles, pursuant to the curses in Deuteronomy 28. You see that? That would eventually put off those idols and put off the gods of the heathen nations and return back to Yahweh Shema Shai in truth. Okay, the remnant. You see that? To ultimately, prepare themselves to be entered into new covenant with their power upon the return of Yahweh Shah Mashiach. You see that? And let me get another one. All right. Let's get Jeremiah 16. Jeremiah 16 and verse 19. It says, O Lord Yahweh Shema Shai, my strength and my fortress, and my refuge in the day of affliction. The Gentiles shall come unto thee from the ends of the earth. Okay, the Gentiles shall come unto thee from the ends of the earth, and shall say, surely our fathers have inherited lies, vanity, and things wherein there is no profit. Okay, so a Christian would read a scripture like this and think that it's talking about actual non-Israelite nations, okay, actual heathen nations. The Gentiles shall come unto thee from the ends of the earth, saying that their fathers have inherited lies and vanity, right? Deception. A Christian would read this and think that it's talking about actual heathen nations, actual non-Israelite nations, all right, in Old Testament prophecy being accepted by the Lord. Okay, but no, all right. A easy way to understand who these Gentiles is speaking of in this particular chapter, Jeremiah, the 16th chapter, is all you got to do is just simply read up above, okay, in verse 14, all right, as you see the subheading right here, God will restore them. Who's are them? Jeremiah 16 in verse 14. Therefore, behold, the days come, said the Lord Yahweh Shema Shai, that it shall no more be said, the Lord Yahweh Shema Shai liveth, that brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. Verse 15. But the Lord Yahweh Shema Shai liveth, that brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north. Okay, and what is the land of the north that is speaking of right here? That's talking about, all right, the United States of America, Babylon the Great in end time prophecy. Okay, because as the scripture speaks about in Jeremiah 50 verse 33, which is also another chapter that speaks of Babylon in these end times, Babylon the Great, okay, which is America. It tells you in Jeremiah 50 verse 33 that Judah and Israel were pressed together in this modern day Babylon, Babylon the Great, America, okay, ruled by the biblical Edomites, the so-called white man, all right, the daughter of Babylon, as it speaks of in Psalms 137, right? And so, as it says right here again in Jeremiah 16, verse 15, but the Lord Yahweh Shema Shai liveth, that brought up the children of Israel, okay, the children of Israel from the land of the north, all right, Babylon the Great, America, and from all the lands whither he had driven them. See that? According to the curse in Deuteronomy 28:64, okay, and I will bring them again into their land. What is their land? The land of Israel, the land that the Lord promised to our forefathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob for as an everlasting covenant, as we read in Psalms 105 earlier, right? It says, and will bring them again, okay, and will bring them again into their land that I gave unto their fathers. Okay, what fathers? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, so this right here, Jeremiah 16 verses 14 and 15, explains who those Gentiles are, okay, that is speaking of down in verse 19. Jeremiah 16 verse 19. O Lord, Yahweh Shema Shah, my strength and my fortress and my refuge in a day of affliction, the Gentiles, all right, shall come unto thee from the ends of the earth. All right, and as a matter of fact, we read earlier, okay, who the Lord said he was scattered throughout the ends of the earth, right? Let's go back to Deuteronomy 28 and 64 again. Deuteronomy 28, verse 64. And the Lord Yahweh Shema Shai shall scatter thee, okay, who's the thee? Israel, among all people from one end of the earth even unto the other. See that? The ends of the earth, right? And there thou shalt serve other gods, idols, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. Okay, and through serving other gods and the idols of these heathen, we became likened unto Gentiles, carried away by dumb idols, as we read in 1 Corinthians 12 and 2 earlier, right? And so going back to Jeremiah 16 and verse 19 again. O Lord Yahweh Shema Shai, my strength and my fortress and my refuge in the day of affliction, the Gentiles shall come unto thee from the ends of the earth. All right, the scattered Israelites. Okay, Israelites scattered amongst the heathen nations throughout the ends of the earth, right? And shall say, surely our fathers have inherited lies, okay, which is what? The different gods and the idols of the heathen nations, their cultures, their customs, right? Their languages, all right? Surely our fathers have inherited lies, vanity, and things wherein there is no profit. And you see, we as Israelites in these latter days that's waking to this truth, that's what we're doing and saying these latter days. Our forefathers, right? Our parents, our grandparents, our great grandparents, that were captive primarily here in America, Babylon the Great. They through generations have inherited lies and vanities. You know, plantation Christianity, okay, the religion of Islam, white Jesus, or some ancient Kemetic Egyptology nonsense, or the whole Pan African doctrine, okay, taking on black culture or so-called Hispanic culture, so-called Native American culture, right? We as Israelites that are waking up to the truth in these latter days, we're declaring that our forefathers and our family members and our parents and grandparents and so on and so forth have inherited lies and vanities and things that have been of no profit to our people in these latter days. You see that? So we as Israelites in these latter days are likened to Gentiles, right? Israelite foreigners, okay, who were raised up in this world in Babylon the Great, in the different parts of the earth that we come from, right? We were raised up following Christianity, following Catholicism, following Islam, following some ancient Kemetic Egyptology nonsense. Okay, waking up, calling ourselves Black or African American, or Jamaican or West Indian or Haitian or Puerto Rican or Dominican or Cuban or Mexican or whatever other bywords that Esau put upon us, right? We're confessing that we were raised up, okay, believing in the lie, right, following the ways of the heathen nations, okay, and then what? Coming back to our power, Yahweh Shema Shai, in sincerity and truth, okay, and putting off these different ways and idols and lifestyles, okay, that we were raised up in these outer days, that made us like unto Gentiles, okay, that made us like unto heathen, right, uncircumcised, right, and all these things. You see that? But all these prophecies, as we've been going into in the Old Testament, that prophesies of Gentiles receiving some form of salvation or mercy or favor to the Lord and redemption to the Lord. That's all only talking about Israelites, scattered Israelites throughout the four corners of the earth, starting primarily here in America, Babylon, and Greek. Okay, because even here in America, we're still scattered, right? We're not in our homeland, the land of Israel, but instead what? We're scattered over here in the West, primarily here in the West, in America, Babylon the Great, okay, where the main bulk of all 12 tribes of Israel are concentrated in, right? Judah and Israel pressed together here in America, Babylon the Great, okay? And in this westernized American system, we were all raised up like into Gentiles, okay? Americanized, westernized, okay? Believing in Christianity or Catholicism or Islam or whatever other custom or culture of the heathen nations that we were raised up following, right? But then upon waking up to the truth, we put off, all right, the ways of these heathen that we were raised up in, okay? And we repent and convert back to Yahweh Shema Shai through men that Yahweh Shema Shai set up to teach us in these latter days, right? Starting with the apostles, the bishops, and the elders of Great Millstone, as well as the men that labor before them, going back to Abba Bivens, all right, to wake us up out of that Gentile, dry bone, heathenistic state, okay, and wake us up to the fact that we're Israelites again, sons of God, okay, and call upon Yahweh Shema Shai, and prepare ourselves for the day of the Lord, to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, okay, and ultimately prepare ourselves to be entered into a new covenant or a new marriage with our power again, all right, with Yahweh Shai being our mediator. You see that? And so, you know, so these prophecies of the Gentiles coming back to the Lord in the Old Testament is only talking about Israel, okay? And so understanding these prophecies should give you a more thorough understanding of, okay, the Gentiles and the uncircumcised and the heathen and the Greeks that you read of throughout the New Testament that the Lord sent Paul and Barnabas to go out and teach, okay? It's talking about Israelites, scattered Israelites among the Gentile nations. All right. And also, before I close out, I want to get this. Okay. First Peter 1, verse 1. Peter, an apostle of Yahushua Mashiach, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. All right. And of course, who are these strangers scattered that the apostle Peter is addressing right here? All right. As we always bring out, this word scattered in First Peter 1, verse 1 is Strong's G 1290, diaspora, okay, a scattering, dispersion of Israelites dispersed among foreign nations, amongst the heathen, right? And it says of the followers of Hamashiach scattered abroad among the Gentiles, right? But then here in the Strong's definition, it says dispersion, i.e., specially and concretely, the converted Israelite resident in Gentile countries, which are scattered abroad. See that? The converted Israelite resident in Gentile countries, which are scattered abroad. These are your Gentiles that you read of in throughout the New Testament. Okay, these are the Gentiles that Paul and Barnabas were ultimately sent out to go out and teach throughout the different regions of the earth. Okay, Rome, Corinth, Galatia. Because as a matter of fact, just to read the verse again, First Peter 1, verse 1, Peter, an apostle of Yahushua Mashiach, to the strangers, all right, the strangers scattered, all right, throughout Pontus, Galatia, all right, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. And as we went into that word scattered, is ultimately speaking about Israelites, all right, scattered amongst the Gentile nations, okay, converted back to the Lord, right? Here, as we see in this verse, the Apostle Peter is addressing, okay, strangers, all right, these strangers, so to speak, in Galatia. See that? And as we showed, that word stranger ultimately speaking of Israelites scattered amongst the Gentile nations, scattered amongst the heathen, right? Well, this verse right here would also proves that the book of Galatians, or the epistle of Galatians written by the apostle Paul, was also written to the Israelites that were scattered in the region of Galatia. You see that? But all in all, okay, the understanding of the Gentiles in the New Testament, okay, in order to understand the Gentiles in the New Testament, all right, that Paul and Barnabas were ultimately sent to go out and teach, you first must understand the prophecies of the Gentiles in the Old Testament. All right, and as I showed throughout this lesson, okay, the Gentiles in the Old Testament that was promised, salvation, mercy, the new covenant is only talking about Israelites and Israelites only. All right. As a matter of fact, before I close out as well, all right, because even when you go into the word Gentile in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew, all right, the word Gentile in the Hebrew is Strong's H1471, Gawayah, Gawayah. All right, and as you see, it says nation, people, all right, usually of non-Hebrew people or the non-Israelite nations, right, which typically applies throughout the scriptures, right? But then it says of descendants of Abraham, all right, this of descendants of Abraham, and then it says right here in the definition C of Israel. See that? Now, why does it say Israel right there? Because that shows in the scriptures, all right, when you come across certain scriptures in the Bible that speaks about Gentiles, sometimes, or usually it could be referring to actual non-Israelite nations, the actual heathen nations, but in some cases Gentiles in certain scriptures and certain prophecies throughout the Bible can also be referring to Israelites. You see that? Israelites in the scriptures can be referred to or likened to Gentiles throughout the scriptures in certain scriptures in the Bible. You see that? And I showed, okay, several examples, all right, going into Old Testament prophecy, okay, where Israelites can be likened to Gentiles in Old Testament prophecy, all right, promise salvation, mercy, the new covenant, redemption, and so on and so forth. You see that? So that should give you more insight and understanding to who those Gentiles that Paul and Barnabas were ultimately sent out to teach when you read throughout the New Testament. Okay, when you read throughout the Acts, the epistles of Paul, right? And so on and so forth. It's only talking about Israelites, point blank, period. Okay. And so, so with that, Lord willing, this lesson was edifying. And before I close out, I want to say, Call Halal Yamla, Yahweh, Ba'ashim Yahushai, Ba'ashim Harachakwadash. Double honors to the apostles, the bishops, and the elders of Great Millstone that I learned this truth from. And also peace and salutations to the hopeful elect of the nation of Israel, scattered throughout the four corners of the earth. Shalom.